He thought it would be a short trip where you could see colors differently. An acquaintance at the time said, no, that's so toxic and totally dangerous. We thought to ourselves, it won't be so bad, and we didn't think about the dose.
Something like that can end in death, that's clear.
I perceived my mother, unfortunately, like a corpse, with a hole in her windpipe, and I knew she had cancer and was dying. And all of this came to be 16 years later in the same way, the way it was visible to me at that time. I knew that she would die that way, and also that our dog would die at that time.
Hello and welcome to Thanatos TV. We would like to share an extraordinary, interesting conversation with you today. Our host in the studio, Jennifer Nejo, welcomes Wilfried Kuhn this time. Jennifer experienced terrible hallucinations as a 15-year-old after a dangerous poisoning. But as a result, another door opened itself up to her. This radically changed her worldview. Professor Dr. Wilfried Kuhn was chief physician at the neurological clinic of the Leopoldina Hospital in Schweinfurt, Germany. He has been dealing with the phenomenon of near-death experiences and similar consciousness experiences for many years. A central question that has long been heatedly discussed is how near-death experiences and similar spiritual experiences can be assessed. What distinguishes them from drug experiences? And above all, do those affected actually experience something real, or are they, so to speak, insubstantial hallucinations? Experiencing is subjective reality, but science looks for the objective, the general. Look forward to an exciting conversation.
Hello, Professor Kuhn.
Hello to you too.
Today I have the opportunity to talk to you about my experience. For this purpose, I would like to briefly describe what happened, also for the audience, just in a few sentences. In youthful recklessness, we consumed jimsonweed. We did not expect much. It was, in retrospect, a potentially deadly dose. We suffered very severe symptoms of poisoning, heart palpitations, burning under the skin, and breathing difficulties, which initially led to unconsciousness. At that point, I had hundreds of nightmares at the same time. When I woke up, the illusion or the hallucination of my then boyfriend stood in front of me and asked me to leave the house because we could not breathe, and led me into the forest. I followed him. I did not even know that I was leaving the house with a hallucination.
May I ask you a question? Your boyfriend was not really there, he was actually lying in the room and also was inebriated, also poisoned?
Poisoned. Yes, exactly. He was lying in the room and was unconscious at the time when I perceived that. He was not really in front of me, but I did not know that. I thought it was real. The only difference was that he was very clearly visible because he was illuminated by a light source that was not in the room. The room was dark. The candles had already gone out, but I saw him very clearly. He asked me to leave because we were poisoned, but he seemed fine.
And you actually went outside?
I went outside. I put on my shoes and followed this hallucination in the belief that I was not alone. I followed him, and the hallucination led me into the forest. The house was on the edge of the forest. We went deep into the forest. He disappeared again and again, and then reappeared. I followed him and finally broke down at a spot with a lot of trees. Then I fell unconscious again. While I was unconscious, a different reality opened up for me. It was as if reality was split into several layers, and I had the opportunity to perceive other realities due to my state. In one of the realities, there was a child, a girl, a forest girl, and finally a higher level opened up.
Can I ask you something in between?
Sure.
Was this forest girl a normal child, or was she perhaps in some form a different being? Could one describe it that way?
Yes, the skin color was a bit different. It didn't really look like a human being. There were human features, human bodily features, but her skin color was paler, and her facial features were slightly different. That's why I call it a forest girl. She looked a little bit like a fairy, perhaps aged 12.
Had you ever seen a picture like that before? If I may ask a bit skeptically?
I've certainly seen pictures of fairies, but she didn't have those pointed ears. It wasn't the classic forest fairy. I wouldn't say that. She looked like a child, a pale child, with a slightly different skin color, perhaps a slightly greenish-grayish tone. But it didn't change throughout the experience. It was always the same face and the same person.
And this person also accompanied you into the house?
Yes.
But she didn't change?
No, she didn't change. Her appearance was very stable.
It was always the same being?
Yes, the same being.
But I interrupted you. You wanted to talk about the higher level.
Yes, exactly. That's where this divine level opened up, which I know from near-death experiences, as many people with near-death experiences have described it. I was flooded with love, in an intensity. You can imagine it like when you're at a concert, standing in front of an amplifier, and the bass vibrates through your body. You know that feeling. And in this case, it was love that I felt so intensely, as if I were standing in front of an amplifier.
I see, but with love, not with bass.
Not with bass, but with the same intensity, as if every single molecule were vibrating. That's the first comparison I can think of. And there were also beings, very large beings of light that I perceived, which consisted of energy. These beings wanted to pass on information to me, and did so on a telepathic level. It was a level where words were not necessary, but the intention behind the thoughts led to the knowledge. That means we talked through intentions. And it was very much about showing me that the world and the reality that we perceive are not the only thing that exist. And it was very important for me to learn that I don't need to be afraid, that there is no need for fear, because death doesn't exist, because it's an illusion, what we think. That reality is an illusion, and that was very, very important. That was repeated very often, and they showed me that fear has no place there. And I also felt what they wanted to tell me. Then I laughed, because I knew that there was really no reason to be afraid of anything, because you're always embedded in the greater whole, because you're infinite.
So, those statements probably referred to you personally on the one hand.
Yes.
But there was also general knowledge on the other hand? Secrets of humanity, or however you want to interpret that? Or how would you describe it?
It was more than secrets of humanity. They were rather universal secrets. It was about the universe itself. The essence of what they conveyed was about how we are embedded, about how realities that come to you as an illusion can never harm you. Never. So, no matter what it is, whether you are afraid of death or terrible events, you're so powerful and so infinite that it doesn't have to concern you.
So, you are safe. You feel safe. Can you say that?
Absolutely safe. Absolutely. Completely loved. And there was also a situation where these light beings talked to each other about me, about my personal development, about intentions. And one of them wanted to give me more information, and the other did not.
Very interesting.
They were not of the same opinion, and for a long time, I was just a listener.
And who got through to you?
The one who said it could impair my development. So I didn't receive it. But one of them wanted to give me more information.
Maybe explain your future in more detail, and what might have been.
I don't know if it was about the future. Because things were communicated via intention, and now I have to relay them with words. I felt that I could have received more information, and the other being, they were both made of absolute love, was of the opinion that it could affect my development, and there was this interaction for a while. There was more than one being. There was also a very large one that was in the background. I was connected to the beings as if I was them myself. The feeling of connectedness to these entities was so strong.
May I ask you about the beings? Can you describe them? You said you were connected to them through light.
Yes, purple and white light.
Were they energy beings? Did they have any facial features?
I couldn't...
Were they human-like?
Human-like. They were human. They felt like people. It was as if I was standing in front of people, only with the difference that they didn't have a human appearance. They radiated a divine principle of intelligence, an absolutely higher intelligence. You immediately knew that you were dealing with fear. Well, that's not the right word. It doesn't have anything to do with fear, but it was a great, deep, deep power. And behind this being was another, deeper power, which was just a divine, primal principle. That was also part of it. It was sort of listening in. These beings were, on the one hand, purple. Some of them shone purple, others were white. They were about 3 meters tall. Definitely larger than humans. They had arms and legs that I could vaguely make out. They were like energy. Not pure light as we know it, but rather like electricity, but not so sharp, a soft energy.
Maybe you could call it a moving energy.
Yes, a moving energy. And when this conversation on this higher level was over, at some point, it closed again. I slipped back into a state of unconsciousness and was awakened by the vision of my grandmother. She was still alive at that time, and she told me she was going to guide me out of the forest because it was slowly getting light. Many hours had passed. She was going to guide me out of the forest, and she was going to take me home. It was time to go. At first, I was happy to see her. At that time, I myself wasn't able to make decisions. I was so strongly affected by the poisoning. I was still in pain. My skin was burning. It was terrible.
You had no free will at that moment.
No free will. I was simply following her. But I was happy because I recognized my grandmother.
Speaking of your grandmother, I remember that you said that your grandmother was also in the light. She was also glowing.
Yes, very brightly.
Is that true?
Yes. As if she were emitting a little light herself, or being strongly illuminated by an unidentifiable light source. And at that time, it was a summer day. It was bright, and yet her light was different.
And your grandmother was still alive at that time?
Yes, she was alive and asleep.
Exactly. You asked her, and she said that at that time she was asleep. She couldn't remember anything, right?
Exactly. She led me through the whole city, through this illusion or hallucination, through the whole city, a long way with several transfers on the metro. In this situation, I was able to hear thoughts from other people. I know to this day that a worker was blaming himself because his girlfriend had left him. I still remember her name. Her name was Sandra, and I knew that if he continued to blame himself in that way, he would destroy his life. So I went to him and I said, "Stop blaming yourself." And of course, this person was very shocked that I knew what he had been thinking about.
I understand.
It was a shock, but something must have been accessible to me. I heard his voice, his thoughts, what he was thinking about.
But you never had contact with him again. You don't know who it was exactly.
No.
Because it would have been interesting to ask him for verification. Whether he can remember whether what you just said was true.
He already told me that back then. At least that's what I can remember. There was no third person who could have verified it. But he said, "How do you know that? And for God's sake, I'll stop anyway, but do you know her?" And he was very confused. But at that point, I got off and was guided away. And then I saw that I couldn't even read the city map. That means my brain was not able to orient itself spatially. The city plan looked like a dream. It wasn't the city at all. It wasn't Vienna. And when I was going home, my grandmother continued to guide me until I was almost at home. Shortly before I reached home, she disappeared. Then I had to find my way to the stairs by myself. I even got lost once. That was very difficult for me, although it really was only a couple of meters. And then I knocked, and my mother opened the door and was so shocked. And so was I.
She probably saw that something was wrong, that you might have taken something or something like that. You can easily see that in your eyes, when your eyes are widened, for example, or...
I was breathing heavily. I still had leaves in my hair. I had a confused expression, was ice cold to the touch. My body was ice cold. She immediately tried to warm me up, and I couldn't even walk properly. And because I was shocked when I saw her and spoke incoherently, it was clear. She then asked me, "Who gave you something? For God's sake, where did you come from?" And she let me into the apartment, and then I noticed this forest girl again. She was curiously watching, and she was sitting in the corner of the room. When I saw her, she was startled. She must have felt found out, because she knew that she shouldn't be listening in. And I was still thinking whether I should send her out. That would have been interesting for my family if I sent someone away. But I saw her, and through gestures, she asked me to be left there. And I ignored her because the sight of my mother shocked me so much.
And then you didn't see anything of that being anymore?
Oh, yes. It was always there. It was sitting in the same place, then walked back and forth. And afterwards, it also intervened in the conversation, in the argument, and supported me. I perceived my mother, unfortunately, like a corpse. She looked terrible, with a hole in her neck. And I knew she had cancer and was dying. Her neck was swollen and blue, with a hole in her windpipe. And I knew that it was cancer and she was dying, and was causing it herself because she wouldn't go to the doctor.
But at that point, she was completely healthy?
Completely healthy. We weren't aware of anything yet. The cancer only came about 16 years later. And unfortunately, it really was misery the way she died. The image of her when she died was exactly the way I saw her back then. But no one knew it yet at that time. My mom was shocked that I would say such a thing. For goodness sake, why would you say that? She went to the mirror to look at herself. Why are you seeing that? And she woke my brothers up. It was summer break. We were all at home. They also heard what I had said and other things. I desperately wanted them to believe me. The forest child agreed with me. It shook its head with me. I was desperate for her to believe me, because I knew that her life would end this way if she didn't react. My mother had had enough and called my father, who was at the office at the time.
And then you needed to go to the hospital?
Exactly. And all of this came to be 16 years later in the same way, the way it was visible to me at that time. I knew that she would die that way, and also that our dog would die at that time. My brother tried to calm me down. Why would you say that? Our dog is sitting right there. Why would you say that our dog will die with our mother? And I said, can't you see? It was incomprehensible to me that they couldn't see what I was seeing. That our dog and our mother would die almost at the same time, and it would be misery. And how could she ignore that she would get cancer and could die of it? I just couldn't understand that. And the forest child also saw it, shook its head, strengthened me, and tried to make them understand. It rolled its eyes, because it was ridiculous to her too.
She supported you?
Yeah, she supported me. I told my mother to go away, because I couldn't take seeing her like that anymore. And sadly, 16 years later, I had to see the exact same thing again. And then she also remembered that I had foreseen it.
And your mother knew this?
Yes.
Did it make the process of dying easier for her?
Yes. It still baffles me to this day, because when she got cancer, she ignored it. She really did feel it early on. And when she told us that she had gone to the doctor, it was already too late. 16 years later, I was an adult woman. The shock that it really had come true was huge, and it was also astounding that my mother herself had no problems with dying and the process of dying, because she knew that everything would be fine. She always assured us as long as she could still speak, even when only a whisper was possible. She told us that she was not afraid. At no point was she scared or in pain. I visited her once when she was still at home. She looked like she was already illuminated by this light. That was one of the last times when she was still at home. She was standing by the kitchen window. She looked beautiful. Her neck was covered by a cloth. And there she radiated a light that reminded me of what I could see at the time with these illusions. I couldn't even say it out loud, but I knew she would definitely die.
It was a few weeks before her death?
It all went very quickly. Maybe 3 weeks. It didn't take that long anymore. She was calm and full of happiness all the time, and always assured us that everything would be fine. And I didn't understand that this experience didn't comfort me. It didn't help me. I was shocked that I couldn't see it coming. That was one thing for me. I thought, well, something is not right with the space-time theory and the consciousness theory. That was clear to me. But I didn't want to deal with it in this situation because my mother was dying.
Did you at any point in these 16 years talk to your mother in detail about your experience? Did she accept that there might have been some truth to it? Or did she suppress it?
We talked about it extensively because it was a big shock that I had to go to the hospital afterwards. It was a big scandal. It was a discussion when I came back from the hospital. My whole family sat down and asked me, "How could you do that? You're the reasonable one. How could you be so stupid? It's highly toxic." And at the same time, there was the content of my experience. My family heard what I said. I also described to my brother right away that there are beings of light that are full of love, that it's so beautiful. They completely disregarded it. My mother was so shocked by what I said. She was shaking for 3 weeks out of fear that
you would suffer lasting
damages?
That
I would suffer lasting damages, that I could have died, which was true.
But later, in the 16 years, you couldn't talk to her about it?
We talked about it again and again. She never really was through with it. She kept bringing it up again and again. She couldn't forget about it and kept thinking about what could have happened to me. Because we disregarded it. We thought it was like a nightmare. No more than a nightmare that she will get cancer. And so the content was not important for my family. For me personally, they were, but in secret, namely the light level or this level of love. I never forgot that. I developed a kind of secret spirituality that was formed through these experiences because I knew that there is a divine basic principle we're all part of. And it was so beautiful and so strong that I couldn't ignore that. In the hospital, I also encountered a light phenomenon. That was the last unusual thing I could still perceive.
At the end of the hospital stay or during the hospital stay?
Still during the hospital stay.
You were, possibly, still partially on another level?
Possibly. I was only there for 1 night. I was hooked up to fluids and an antidote and whatever else you are given when poisoned. I fell asleep and woke up again. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I had been taken to the hospital the morning before, and in the night I woke up and could shockingly remember everything that had happened, and was of course very worried about my friend because I knew I'd left him. What happened afterwards? And then I reoriented myself in the room. I thought, oh God, I'm in the hospital. Where are my parents? Help! And then I looked at my hands, which were hooked up to an IV, and then I noticed the light phenomenon. It was a purple moving energy, similar to the light beings, but they had been much, much stronger. This was a slightly transparent purple, and if you concentrated on it, then you could form energy balls. And I could deliberately send these energy balls through the room. The interesting thing about these energy balls was that they sort of interacted with the wall and then bounced off, and it was really nice to look at.
They were made of energy and wafting or flickering through the air? Were they full of light?
Kirlian photography probably comes closest to it, or electricity maybe, Elm's fire, but not as sharp. The edges were softer, and they were shaped like balls, about this big, and didn't move very quickly through the room. They weren't moving with high speed, but I could control them willingly, and then they interacted with the wall and bounced off it. I knew right away in that moment that it was something that I was then able to see as the last perception, as the last otherly perception. That was somehow clear to me. Since then, I was able to verify this. I was able to find two people, because nowadays so many near-death experiences are publicly shared. So I was able to find two people who could perceive this same light phenomenon with their hands.
Was it only with your hands, or did you also notice something else with your legs or with your head, or was it more focused on your hands?
For me, it was focused on the hands, and I could control the light in such a way that I could strengthen it through concentration. The other person, who also had the same perception, was an American major.
He had a near-death experience?
Exactly. He had a near-death experience and could perceive this light phenomenon on the rest of his body too. The other person experienced it in a dream during an astral journey. So we were in 3 different states of consciousness, where everyone could form energy balls and send them through the room, and for everyone they somehow bounced off the wall. I take that as a sign that it may be an undiscovered energetic structure.
Do you think someone who was just sitting there normally, like I am sitting here now, could have seen that? Was someone there by chance?
No one was there.
No one?
And I don't think they could have seen it.
Because it was probably happening on a different level.
Only perceivable through a frequency shift, so to speak. Only through a change of consciousness can we perceive these states. This major can induce it through deep meditation. And the other person that I found...
So it definitely was an energy ball, that can be said, but it was possibly, an esoteric would now say, a subtle energy.
Exactly.
It went in that direction, at least.
Yes.
Very interesting. You have summarized everything quite briefly, but it was still very remarkable to hear. It seems to have been a near-death experience. Do you also see it that way?
Yes.
You were obviously close to death. Realistically speaking, you could have died. But from my point of view, on the one hand I am a neurologist, on the other hand a near-death researcher, from my point of view, you've described several elements that you would find in classic near-death experiences. Although nowadays, in classic near-death experience, we don't assume that always exactly the same elements have to occur. We also include other unusual phenomena, also spiritually transcendent phenomena. We even go so far today as to say that the term near-death experience is actually not accurate at all, but that extraordinary, spiritually transcendent phenomenon is a more fitting term. Have you already classified your experience using the Greyson Scale?
Yes.
Which score did you have? Because I have been counting along in my mind while you were talking. Of course, I can't say 100%, but I have reached a rough score.
I have thought about it, and there are a few elements that lie in between. So I can't really give you a score. For example, the out-of-body experience. I can't really say if that was part of my experience, because on the one hand, I was in my body, but I also experienced situations over this long period of time where I didn't have a body at all. So there was both. So I can't really give it a score. I think the highest value is 5 points, or...
In some, it's much higher. I unfortunately don't know it by heart, but there are around 8 or 9 parameters with up to 2 points. So, around 20, I think. But, as far as I know, starting at 7 points, it's a real near-death experience. But it's all relative. The Greyson Scale was developed to measure the depth of a near-death experience. A value above 7 is considered a real NDE. But that is perhaps the wrong expression. Let's say it is a deeper near-death experience. And according to my calculations, you are over 10 points at least if you sum it all up, although that is a rough calculation. But I can say that with certainty, and that is a near-death experience of medium depth.
Later on, I also thought about how at the time, when I was in the forest where the highest level opened up, I can't even say if I was really breathing normally. I can't answer that.
Normally, you would say, yes, you have to have somehow still been breathing, probably just very slowly, because otherwise you really would have died. Unless it was a miracle and your grandmother saved you through a miracle healing. That is, of course, not to be ruled out.
I didn't notice any of that, but I think that I was physically very impaired.
Something like that can end in death, that's clear. Your boyfriend didn't experience anything. He was completely unconscious and thankfully survived.
The dose was so high that my boyfriend was unconscious for a long time. And later he was so disoriented that his key broke off in the lock, so that he was actually locked in the apartment. Only because I was able to alert others after the illusions led me outside. Only then could we free him with the help of the police and firefighters.
I'm interested, did you read about jimsonweed beforehand? What kind of reactions it causes? Or did you just try it out? Did your boyfriend read anything about it?
Yes, my boyfriend read something about it. He thought it would be a short trip where you can see colors differently for a short time. An acquaintance at the time said, no, that's so toxic and totally dangerous. We thought to ourselves, it won't be so bad, and we didn't think about the dose.
Specialists like Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD, but also others, Christian Rech, a hallucinogenic researcher who also wrote a lot about it. Did you read any personal accounts from people who have experienced it, who have taken jimsonweed seed pods? Are there similarities?
I searched for them. I searched for them because I really wanted to know if people had similar experiences. Most of the time, people hallucinated crazy, absurd things or were unconscious when the dose was high enough. I found a single case on the internet who had an experience of unity, also on a very, very high dose, a dangerously high dose, and he was able to perceive his hands as a light phenomenon too. But the difference was that the light phenomenon was white and silver for him, while all the other 3 cases I found saw purple light.
I also tried to do a little research, but all I know is that Albert Hofmann wrote in one of his books that it is a plant of the gods. The shamans used it earlier, and it was extremely psychoactive. Whether that means a hallucinogenic effect, or also a transition to another reality. So it was definitely known that it can do such things.
Carlos Castaneda also described the plant, especially the South American variant. And there it was really used by shamans. I have the feeling that if I hadn't taken this really dangerously high dose, this potentially deadly dose, I wouldn't have had this experience.
Yes, it's common that you then, of course, get deeper with a higher dose. Although I know from LSD that you can even achieve enormous effects with very low doses.
For me, of course, because of this experience, or these experiences, I had many questions. On the one hand, it was very strange that the space-time continuum had changed, that I could see the future, that I could perceive this phenomenon, but also at the same time in relation to the dreams. Because now I have nothing else left. I'm still interested in these phenomena, so I observe my dreams. I think if you want to do consciousness research, it is good if you take a look at your own dreams at least. I was able to find parallels between my dreams and this experience. For example, this transition from everyday consciousness to dream consciousness. the possibility to connect with light there. If you meditate in a dream, you can achieve deeper dream levels. If you manage to enter a lucid dream, where the consciousness is practically activated again, where you know that you are dreaming, I try to meditate. And then I can reach full levels of light that remind me a bit of the experience. There's a big difference for me between dreaming and that experience, though. A dream is still recognizable for me as an illusory dream feeling, even if it's a lucid dream.
May I ask, in your dreams, do you also have transcendent experiences?
Yes.
You enter other worlds or meet other beings, otherly beings?
Yes, there are such dreams. Dreams can be so different. I'm a person who has to make a lot of effort to be able to remember my dreams. There are different classes of dreams. There are transcendent dreams, dreams where I also met light beings who gave me advice about my attitude that were very important for me. So it really was a very important source of communication for me. That has already taken place. And then there are also dreams that say less, that are non-lucid, and then there are many steps in between. There are fluid transitions.
I have some things to say about dreams, but first, could you illuminate the entire process a little closer? So it started with the intake, and then you left the house, and for me the interesting thing was that you left the house physically. You definitely went into the forest, so that part didn't happen on some esoteric or astral level. Your friend led you outside, urged you to leave the house. He was unconscious.
He was unconscious at the time.
So your friend, in some form, I am a neurologist. As a neurologist, you would say those were all hallucinations. Yes, but I am also a near-death researcher and have other insights. And that's where you would say, okay, as it happens in some near-death experiences, beings present themselves, or astral bodies, as esotericism says, that then detach themselves from the physical body, as may have been the case for your friend, and then move on in an astral level, in a fine energy level. And then probably, speculatively speaking, he made contact with you on this level and guided you outside. Maybe he also saved you.
Maybe also to save himself.
That was perhaps also his intention, to save you so that you didn't stay in that room. That is certainly one of the cases where you could assume, especially since he was also glowing with light, that is also an indication of an astral body. Astral basically means glowing and light. That could be an indication that he came to you on this level. And the second thing is what happened with your grandmother. Your grandmother also saved you, I would say, and she was glowing too.
Yes, she was also glowing.
She was sleeping at the time. She wasn't unconscious, but she was sleeping, and you know, in sleep, the astral body also detaches. At least that's what we know from the near-death experience. It can detach and move around. And your grandmother, you can assume that, she went to you and guided you.
My mother actually woke up my grandmother. She called her and she was sleeping. My mother was desperate when I came home and called her. That's why we know for sure that my grandmother was asleep. She called and said, "For God's sake, why are you calling me this early in the morning?"
It's incredibly interesting, because on the one hand, you were always a bit in this world, that's the part with the forest and the tram and metro when you met that man. And on the other hand, you also experienced this other level. Again, the other level means, for example, perception of astral beings on the one hand, but also experiencing other levels like the perception of light beings. And that is also very typical for near-death experiences, that you meet these beings, either in the form of light or you feel them as energy. One typical thing, or if we ask, how do near-death experiences actually affect a person? Near-death experiences usually include two things. A feeling of unconditional love, which you have experienced, and knowledge. That is an aspect that usually isn't mentioned.
Yes, indeed.
But knowledge is often conveyed in some way. Maybe I can tell a story very briefly. I took part in a near-death congress in Munich, and there you had to lead workshops. Individual people who had a near-death experience reported, and there were many cases, but 2 cases were very interesting, which go a bit in the direction of your experience when it comes to receiving knowledge. I remember one young man who described how he was led into space. The whole universe was shown to him by an accompanying being, a light being, a being that accompanied him, that explained everything to him, explained the whole world and how it all connects, and he understood everything. I think that was the case with you too, that you understood everything. Although you can no longer remember exactly what it was in retrospect, that is often the case for near-death experiences too.
I knew that I was not allowed to take all the information with me. That was clear to me. It was also made clear during the conversation that I was not allowed to know everything. They thought carefully about what information to pass on to me. I was very young. I think it also had to do with the fact that it would have influenced my life path too much, because my life path, I have to be honest, has completely changed from that day on. It has gone in a completely different direction. I can trace many of my life events back to this experience.
In near-death experience, one essential factor is the spiritual transformation that takes place after the experience. Near-death experiencers usually change their life or have completely different views, become anti-materialistic, become more spiritually transcendent. But I would like to go back to the second report from this near-death experiencer in Munich. It was an older woman. She'd also had a near-death experience, and she also reported that she had seen a different world, where a being guided her and showed her everything. But they stayed on Earth, and she was shown the entire history of Earth. She gave us some examples of what she saw. She was shown how the Egyptian pyramids were built, and she was still able to remember some kind of strange tilting mechanism. But we didn't go into more detail. She also described how she was shown an archaeological site in Spain that was discovered 10 or 15 years later. I just wanted to name these as examples of the knowledge that is often gained during these experiences. But of course, it is crucial that you do not take the knowledge with you, though there was the one lady who was able to partially retain some of what she saw.
I think that also happened on purpose, so that you can then verify it for yourself. For instance, the near-death experience of Emma Otero, who was shown the death of her child 23 years before the fact. After a beautiful near-death experience, she was given a glimpse of what would happen, and 23 years later it came to be. I think these pictures are shown to us so that we can see for ourselves, so that we can verify it later. That's my guess.
It is definitely the case that near-death experiencers are up to 100% convinced that what wasn't shown to them, or what they experienced, was real and not just some trick of the mind. Of course, as a neurologist, if you tell a neurologist, 99% of my colleagues would say, "That sounds nice," but it was all a hallucination.
That it was all just a coincidence. That is the problem.
Exactly. And what does hallucination even mean? Of course, in a certain way, it is correct to say that it is a hallucination, because a hallucination is defined as a perception of the senses without an external source of stimuli. And when you saw the light beings, though I have to add the external source of stimuli must be verifiable, when you saw the light beings on a material level, it's not verifiable. But in psychiatry, I'm also a psychiatrist, you often have the situation that someone is admitted to the hospital with hallucinations. And then, for example, the patient will describe how he's being irradiated by his neighbor with a radiation weapon or something like that. Then, as a psychiatrist, you think, yes, well, that's not very believable, but strictly speaking, you would have to check the source of stimuli and see exactly whether that is the case or not. you would have to go to the neighbour and check it. And if such a source of radiation was found, you would have to call the police and so on. But because it seems so unbelievable, usually medical action is taken. However, it's important to note that usually there are additional symptoms. The patient will not only talk about a radiation weapon, but also other hallucinations that also have an impact, and so on and so forth. This source of stimuli is, in your case, not verifiable. But again and again during your experience, there were moments when you had perceptions that are verifiable, but weren't necessarily transcendent.
No.
I have two other points. If I may continue to interpret it in this way, it's incredibly interesting to do so. This precognitive part of your experience, and when you could perceive this gentleman's thoughts at the tram stop.
And their consequences.
And their consequences. You were able to telepathically hear his thoughts. That's a paraphenomenon. We must always consider that it was a subjective experience, yes, but that you could have at least hypothetically verified.
Yes, you could have. And I think that's already been done for people with near-death experiences, who are able to later tell their doctors what they were thinking during surgery.
Yes, that's exactly what is crucial for the entire discussion. So this topic can be brought closer to science to any degree, that it may one day be recognized by science, or that it becomes general knowledge, that the general population or our culture recognizes it. Such verifiable aspects are very important in that sense. That would be the first point, with the gentleman where you are unfortunately not able to verify your perceptions. The second thing is, of course, the part with your mother, which was even more clear. But even there, skeptics may say it was a coincidence. But then additionally, the thing with the dog happened. Then again, every skeptic can again say that was a coincidence. In my experience with near-death experiences, you can find hundreds of pieces of verifiable evidence, and there are several studies, as you just mentioned, that then someone left their body in the hospital bed, saw themselves lying on the bed, heard the nurses and doctors talking to each other, and could also say what they were wearing, even though this person did not know them before. Yes, there are not countless examples, but there are hundreds of data points that could be verified. I talked to a colleague once. Even if we have 1 or 2 or 3 such verifiable data, no one is actually interested. You have to say honestly, it doesn't help. It's just the dogma of this materialistic or naturalistic worldview that doesn't allow you to accept such things. Of course, your experience is also part of that.
Yes, of course it's difficult. When I think about this light-filled moment with my hands and the people I found, that would be inducible. It could be repeated. You could certainly try to start trials. There are 8 billion people in this world. I don't want to know how many of them could actually do something like that.
To come back to this example with the hands, as a neurologist, you would say, yes, that's just your imagination or a hallucination. But if you look at esoteric literature, such phenomena have been described over and over again. And ultimately, they are traced back to the vital or astral body, which was activated in some way at that moment. Or, a different explanation, your own perception was activated. Maybe you're glowing right now, too.
That was my feeling. Exactly, that was my feeling. We always glow.
But because we are in this reality, this transcendent ability to perceive is
blocked.
Blocked, yes. You could explain it that way too, but in my opinion it clearly speaks for a light body. The astral body is a light body, and the esoterics also say aura. It could also be interpreted as aura. To the other point with the dream and your precognition, It is known in the literature, but also parapsychologists dealt with the fact that you can also connect telepathically in a dream with someone else. 40 to 50 years ago, there was once an American researcher, I think Montague, who wrote a book about dream telepathy. But like many other things in parapsychology, it was somehow forgotten or ignored. So, in a dream, you can actually contact other realities under certain conditions. And it is also known, and I even know a well-known parapsychologist at a university, I don't want to say the exact details, who himself experienced how, in a dream, his wife, who was lying next to him, suddenly woke up and said our son had an accident in Australia, or daughter, I don't remember exactly. And that was actually the case, that at that exact time, it was later verified, an accident occurred in Australia in which the son or daughter was seriously injured. But they survived, as far as I know. So, these are phenomena that can be classified as parapsychological phenomena, and parapsychological phenomena are rejected by traditional science, by naturalistic science. They are ignored.
That's right, yes.
They simply do not exist, and that is why the materialistic, naturalistic worldview is not complete.
That's right, I completely agree with you. I think it's a shame that we still are so attached to a model of pure physicality, which has so few possibilities for describing our reality and our depth of experience. Why should you ascribe yourself to a model that cannot describe reality when better models exist? The only good thing is that the internet is now making a network possible so that many people are now talking about their experience. And we mustn't forget the fact that we have the opportunity to verify it for ourselves by observing our dreams for a long time. I managed to do that. I've been observing my dreams for 2 years. Within those 2 years, there were 3 to 5 significant dreams that also showed me the future. It's work, but everyone who wants to verify it for themselves, I'm convinced that everyone will be able to have such dreams if they write them down every day. That means, with a bit of work, anyone can verify these things for themselves. If you have the desire, then there is a possibility for your consciousness to overcome the limits of space and time.
What also interests me is that you say that in these dreams there actually are transcendent aspects. Was that the case even before your experience with jimsonweed?
To be honest, I've only been routinely recording my dreams for the last 2.5 years. Before that, I can't think of any transcendent dreams, simply because I can't remember them. Our consciousness needs to concentrate on dream events so that they can be perceived at all. My dream memory was simply not present in the past. I woke up and didn't remember anything. So I can't say that I didn't have them before, but my dream memories improved with this targeted attempt at remembering. I have friends who haven't had such experiences, but who now also remembered their dreams through our common hobby. They also had transcendent and precognitive dreams. This makes me think that having such an experience is not a prerequisite for having transcendent dreams.
From NDE research, we know that after a near-death experience, people have an affinity for paraphenomena through dreams. But some also gain healing abilities, or can perceive auras or light.
I don't think that is the case for me. I can't perceive ghosts.
So, you can't read my thoughts right now?
No, I can't. I've already heard that for some people it really affects them and brings something out in them. But for me, the effects weren't that strong in that sense.
Yes, it's not the case for everyone, but it is often described.
Probably I already had abilities before. I really had to work on my dream memory. What I also noticed during a different experience, I had surgery recently. Everything went well, but because I'm so attentive, I thought to myself, I can also use this for my consciousness research. The argument is always made that consciousness cannot be fundamental and infinite, because then the state of unconsciousness should not exist, because then consciousness is gone. I was able to observe this very closely in the course of being put under anesthesia. The fact that I had to fall asleep or become unconscious and then wake up again showed me, using the same trick that I used for my dream memory, that there was a black void in between, a black area which I was able to remember and thus was an experience. That means it wasn't my consciousness that was extinguished, but it went into a state of blackness, a state of non-existence. Even in Vedic culture, non-existent states are described as part of consciousness. And I think we just get caught up in the language, because our language uses the word unconsciousness. But in reality, from my experience, this is a state that takes place within the spectrum of consciousness. The spectrum of consciousness can seem to range from infinite experiences of oneness, transcendent light experiences, all the way up to this black non-existence experience. And I also discovered this state through my dream work. I somehow realized that when you have a dream and become aware, or even a dream event changes, that these black non-existent states are faded in, and they also lead to the fact that you can't remember that you're actually someone else and sleeping in bed, and preserve the dream identity. These are shifts of consciousness, and so these non-existent states happen either when memory gaps are desired by consciousness or separations are made. In the hospital, it was also like that. I woke up immediately, reviewed what happened, and was able to detect this black area, which I already knew from my dream work, and which can also be found in Vedic culture, and which sometimes is described in near-death experiences. Otherwise, it would not have been necessary. The last picture would have been of the anesthesiologist, and the next, waking up. This black non-existent state would not have been necessary. I could also remember the feelings I had in this space. I had a connection to the people, to the surgeon who was present. I knew what he felt during the operation. That was also still possible. So I knew the moods of everyone.
So it's similar to near-death experiences, where people describe leaving their body, but you didn't leave your body at that time?
No. And it also wasn't like I could really recount the content of their thoughts. It was just feeling. I knew what he felt over time.
Perceiving the feelings of others, that's often described for the life review part of near-death experiences. Especially the feelings of people. We all carry out actions in our lives, and what these actions have done to the people in our lives, what feelings we trigger in them, not only with the ones it directly affects, but also in the chain of other people who may not even know. These feelings that were caused, uncomfortable feelings such as fear or stress.
What one triggered through one's own actions. And then I think to myself, if your brain is dying, or really should be unconscious, as in my case, you really shouldn't be able to recount information about something like that. Somehow, it's already clear that there has to be more.
Yes, exactly. For you, it's a matter of course, but for many others, it still isn't. You just told me that during the anesthesia. So it was during anesthesia, if I understand it correctly.
Yes, general anesthesia, yes.
Then you perceived this feeling of black emptiness.
Yes.
But for me, it sounds like you were actually conscious. Or, in other words, you consciously perceived something, namely that black space. If you are unconscious, normally when you are under general anesthesia, you don't perceive anything at all. So you had to have been conscious while you were under anesthesia in some way to have been able to perceive the black and have that be registered in your memory and then incorporated again in some way so that you could then remember it after waking up. And, if I understood you, you were a little surprised that you were able to perceive this black space? But I would say it's not unusual. I have read several cases in the literature of people with near-death experiences who also, for example, at the beginning of a near-death experience, simply fell into a black void, which they perceived. Then, of course, other elements were perceived as the near-death experience developed. Some then went into the light, others experienced other things. But a near-death researcher, her name is P.H.M. Atwater, an American woman who is very well known, she tried to classify this in more detail, what you experience in a near-death experience in terms of light, or what forms of light occur. And she found that there are also phases of dark light. I think she developed 3 or 4 stages. You can read about it in one of her books. So there is darkness, but as a variant of light. And then there are different levels of light that go up to the brightest mystical light. She tried to differentiate these light forms based on these experiences. And I would say that fits to your case, even if it was not a near-death experience, but general anesthesia. You can experience something dark there.
We also experience this in dreams. In these dreamless phases of sleep, this also occurs. Or when someone thinks they didn't dream at all, went to bed and woke up again. And then you really have to concentrate on it, to realize that this void was there, because otherwise you could simply tune it out as nothing. That's the difficulty. I also had to concentrate on what had happened, just like I do for my dream memory. If I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have noticed. Then I would have said it was nothing.
May I say something as a skeptic? If I close my eyes now, I don't see anything either. But what you experienced was something else, as far as I understand it. When you were under anesthesia and then woke up, you were somehow able to remember something like that. That's the extraordinary thing.
Yes, you have to concentrate on it. When I close my eyes, it's clear that it's dark, but there was no time in that case either. It's a different state than just darkness, where you can still feel yourself lying down. You also have other perceptions when you're just closing your eyes. That was real nothingness, a bodiless nothingness. You don't have a body anymore, and you're in a black void. And this black void also occurs in near-death experiences. This state of non-existence where you're no longer lying down or feeling the bed beneath you.
Was that unpleasant, or was it neutral?
Neutral, because there was no feeling to it anymore. But to be honest, thinking about it now, with full daytime consciousness, I feel it was a non-desirable state, because it is the opposite of the light-filled state of all being. That is the absolute absence of everything.
In near-death experiences, there is also a certain percentage of negative experiences. And such experiences of darkness, or some people associate it with hell and other negative scenarios, these experiences are also classified as negative experiences. Of course, other things are also included in the negative experiences, but that is seen as part of it. Perhaps another comment on this precognition. I once read about an Irish parapsychologist several years ago. He tried to explain precognitions in such a way that the memory center, which is neurobiologically the hippocampus and the amygdala, for example, and other areas, play a role. This memory center is symmetrical in time and space. That means, on the one hand, of course, the past is stored, and on the other hand, impulses from the future can also be perceived. So that's a possible interpretation, although, of course, the impulses from the future are not so easily perceived. You have to have a certain sensitivity, as you probably do, a sensitivity gained through a near-death experience, or through some type of transcendent relation. A normal person can't perceive precognitions.
It's not accessible to me otherwise either. I would know the lottery numbers if that were the case. But there's a danger that you then say everything is predetermined, because if I can perceive the future, because it is stored there, then it must have already occurred. And then you come back to this dilemma. Does free will exist?
Is everything programmed?
Yes, exactly. Superdeterminism.
But it could also be that only certain, that's the case with the simulations, with weather simulation, with the climate, there are also only possibilities. And you could also say, but that's purely speculative, that the future is only partially determined, that there are very specific fixed points and other things are open. It could be like that, but of course we can't know for sure. We can't say that for sure, but it's definitely interesting. Also with the near-death experience. I once read, I think, that paraphenomena, especially precognition, occur for 3% to 5% of people at post-examinations. They are left with the ability to have precognitions.
That then lasts.
That then lasts. I don't know if it will fade away again after a while, but at least there was a certain increase in precognitive experiences after a near-death experience.
For me, I have to admit that it has accompanied me all my life, but I only noticed after this experience that I knew things I couldn't have known. A certainty, or sometimes I even have a picture, a short apparition in my mind's eye. Unfortunately, it often has to do with death or dying. That's when this precognition happens quite often for me. For example, I knew that a colleague, where at the time it was still unclear if she had cancer, I unfortunately saw a picture and knew she was going to die. Of course I didn't say anything, but it's a burden for me, because I already know that when such pictures come, it's like a photo. And I also had it in my dreams, and then it actually had to do with the death of an animal.
Well, there are mediums that make these skills a profession, or maybe just have it as a hobby. But I guess you would never try to do it professionally?
No, definitely not, because I can't induce it. It comes suddenly, years can go by. I haven't found out how I can steer it or apply it. I don't have abilities like that.
Mediums usually use tarot cards or some astrological.
That wouldn't help me.
Have you ever tried to read tarot card?
Yes, when I was a child.
So you never tried again later on?
No, to be honest, I didn't.
But it would be interesting.
Possibly.
Because it creates a resonance. Not for everyone, but maybe for you.
Possibly. I've never tried. As I said, there are long periods in between where nothing happens. In the case of dreams, there were a few within 2 years. So I'm not really inclined.
No, of course, I understand. I wouldn't be either. Are there any more uncertainties, or is everything clear?
It would be nice if everything was clear, but you've helped me a lot, and I'm grateful that I was allowed to hear your opinion on the whole thing. But I also have a question for you. How did you come to deal with all of this?
Well, I've asked myself this question before. It's certainly unusual when I say that I'm a neurologist and I'm also a psychiatrist, but I'm also interested in many other things, and I don't know where that comes from. I don't know whether it's hereditary or not. It's hard to say, but I've always been interested in anomalous phenomena since I was a teenager. But above all, I've been interested in insights. What is the world? What is it made up of? What can one still recognize? What can one still learn? And so on and so forth. And that's why I was initially interested in natural sciences. Also, when choosing a career, I thought to myself, what interests me the most? Where can you gain the most insights? And I was torn between biochemistry on the one hand and astrophysics on the other. And so I was thinking back and forth. In the end, I decided against astrophysics, because at the time it was said astrophysics is not necessarily something you can make a lot of money with, or even have a good income with. In any case, I then decided on chemistry, and it was also a very interesting degree, I have to say. But then I realized that in chemistry, everything is very mechanistic. It's interesting, You could make new substances. I made some new substances, with antimony, for example. But at some point, I realized, no, that's too boring for me in the long run. And then I decided to study medicine, and I have to say, in retrospect, that was the right way, because, of course, I was able to learn many other things, and it was simply much more lively than pure chemistry. But at least in terms of natural sciences, I have always been interested in all kinds of things, still am. I have a lot of magazines, whether they are popular or scientific ones. But at the same time, suddenly an interest arose in phenomena that are not well known and not well explored in natural sciences. And back then I also came across a magazine by chance. I still remember how it happened. It must have been a coincidence. I must have been guided in some way. In a bookshop, I saw a card with an ad for the magazine Esoterra. I don't know if you know it.
I haven't heard of it.
It existed back then, but it was discontinued in the 1980s. In this magazine, many of these paranormal phenomena, everything that went on in this field, was described. Very interesting things, and that's how I got into it. Then, once I completed my postdoc teaching qualification, I settled down and had to build a reputation for myself in natural sciences. And then I kind of lost sight of that interest. But I read Moody's book, though I didn't really get involved with it. And in the early 1990s, I saw a report on near-death experiences on TV, in which Professor Susan Blackmore, an English psychologist, presented herself as a skeptic and said everything was clear with near-death experiences. She gave an example with the tunnel effect, that it is generated in the retina and the occipital visual center. Why over both? That was unclear. She didn't explain it further. And then, like with strokes, where it is known, when there is poor circulation in the retina, a tunnel effect can occur. But the tunnel gets smaller and smaller, and then it gets darker.
Darker.
Yes, but she didn't explain it more than that. But I thought that the entire phenomenon had thus been explained. Only later, by chance, I encountered near-death experience again and got more involved with it and thought about it again. Thinking from my perspective as a neurologist, is that even true? And then I realized, no. In reality, with near-death experiences, it's exactly the other way around. There is a tunnel effect, but there are also very different tunnels. It's not always shaped like a pipe, but there are also cave paths that intertwine and fork.
They are sometimes vibrant with colors.
Yes, in that respect, it doesn't fit. And in neurology, as already mentioned, with strokes, it gets dark at some point. And in near-death experience, it gets bright. But the light is an unusual light. It is bright, but not blinding. It is a mystical light. It radiates love and other things that are extremely positive, which does not occur in strokes.
And is never mentioned.
So I became suspicious. Then I researched and found other neurological explanations which can still be found in academic literature. I checked them all, thought them through, and came to the conclusion that a lot of things are wrong, or only partially correct.
That means you're a true skeptic who looks at things critically, and you have a pioneering spirit, which made you want to illuminate it again.
That is certainly right. I have always worked with many medics and natural scientists. I still am in contact with them. They're from different medical fields, too. But I have to say, when you address this topic, there is usually not a lot of interest to talk about it. Most people have no real interest or no motivation to deal with it. They are satisfied with their worldview, the naturalistic, materialistic worldview. They believe that everything can be explained with it. and anomalous phenomena simply ignored, or deemed a hallucination or some kind of fraud. It is ignored, and there is no compulsion to deal with it. And that is also what I have found. If you really deal intensively with near-death experiences, and especially talk to people who have had a near-death experience and listen to them completely, then you get a very different feeling. Then these near-death experiences are not fully captured by the simple Greyson Scale, which does contain points that have to do with near-death experiences, but doesn't explain them. The German Neurological Society had a conference last year, a seminar on near-death experiences and neurology. And they now simply explain it in such a way that certain waves in the brain, gamma waves and also the death wave, are possibly the cause, and say now everything is explained. And the 100 other potential hypotheses that were brought up earlier, they no longer play a role. They are now unimportant. There was this hypothesis with the endorphins.
Yes, I read about that as well.
The well-known neurobiologist, Professor Gerhard Roth, is often cited in this context. He says he once had a near-death experience. He probably didn't have a complete one. He may have had the beginning of one. I don't want to rule that out. He felt a very pleasant feeling, and he probably saw a little light, but nothing else. And then he said, I heard a lecture of his and also saw him on TV. He said, I had a near-death experience, but you can explain everything neurologically. Then he sits there as a professor. But in reality, it is simply that certain phenomena are ignored. One of the most important things with near-death experience that is completely ignored by scientists is that they are paraphenomena. There are several paraphenomena within the near-death experience. It starts with the out-of-body experience, where people leave their body, lie on the operating table under anesthesia, or have their eyes closed, are in a coma and perceive what the doctors talk about, what they are wearing, and so on and so forth. This is a paraphenomenon, because the eyes are closed. How could they know that? That's where it starts. Then, of course, it continues with the panoramic life review. This is also a paraphenomenon, because things are experienced that were caused by one's actions in others that one may not even know about.
And their feelings can be perceived.
Yes, and their feelings, the fear, the terror that was caused. I don't want to know what kind of panoramic life review Putin would experience. But in general, that's a paraphenomenon. Of course, there are other things like precognition or contact with light beings, or the information that is gained. So there are a number of paraphenomena that are ignored.
Die werden halt einfach ausgeblendet und es wird eben zum Beispiel nur gesagt, ja, bei der Migräne gibt's auch.
For example, it is said that migraines can cause hallucinations. So, migraines could have something to do with near-death experiences.
Whoever had migraines and a near-death experience will know the two have nothing to do with each other. And what has always bothered me is that it is often ignored that such phenomenon also can occur without lethal threat. For example, near misses in traffic. In these cases, you can't argue that they were caused by death waves. In fact, no death waves were activated yet. This is also completely ignored. That's a shame.
I just remembered a medical colleague of mine who drove his car on a snowy road on a winter night and drove into a curve and had an accident. And then he told me that a few seconds or tenths of a second before the accident, he predicted that he would crash in this curve. A little later, it happened. He saw it exactly as a picture that then really happened right after. There are many such phenomena. And these things are always ignored or put aside because they may not fit into the concept or worldview of the person.
It would mean a complete paradigm shift, and I think that's why there is a major hurdle to even think about any of it. I have now heard from you that you have researched and come across all these contradictions, and thus were able to approach this topic on this high level.
Exactly. I then studied this topic a little more intensively and read a lot of books, but also had a lot of personal encounters, including with people with near-death experiences. And that's how things slowly changed. It actually led to an inner paradigm shift in me. It's not that easy to achieve this. I noticed that myself.
What was it like?
It was very slow. But honestly, I have always doubted materialistic thinking. I wasn't a consistent atheist in the sense that I thought purely materialistically, but I didn't think much about it, as many people do. You live your life and take things as they come.
So there wasn't a single aha experience, but it slowly changed in this direction?
That's right. Of course, there were certain experiences. I can give you an example where I learned that there might be other realities. I once took a drug too, ecstasy, but in the 1980s, when it wasn't banned in Germany yet. My wife and I brought it home from the USA. At the time, people talked about set and setting. You had to do it under certain conditions. You weren't allowed to do it under stress or while listening to loud music. You were supposed to be calm. My wife and I had an experience. She experienced the same thing as me. We felt unconditional love, and interestingly, the plants, like the plants in this room, we felt an energy around the plants that was constantly moving. Both of us.
That reminds me of something.
Like an aura, like for you with the light. There was no light in that sense.
You felt it.
We saw it.
You saw it too.
We didn't only feel it.
Interesting.
We saw it. It was a wafting energy, as you might imagine an aura.
Very interesting.
It was really impressive. It makes you think. When you read different things afterwards, you see it with different eyes and can understand it better. Also, what you experienced with the light phenomena. That's one of the aspects that already had an impact in this direction.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm grateful that I was allowed to hear your opinion. And thank you very much for the interview.
I also want to thank you very much. It was really extraordinary what you experienced. I will mention it at conferences and in book chapters to pass your story on.
Gladly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.